In terms of drug policy, all three articles we will be discussing argue for a conflict model theory of policy development. This is opposed to a rational order model theory in which most people believe policy comes from. I will briefly explain the two. A rational order model sees policy development as emerging from scientific or utilitarian calculation of the effectiveness of alternative approaches in achieving agreed-upon ends, or policy designed to find solutions to problems aimed at providing overall public good. However, this would seem to be far from how policy, and especially drug policy, is actually designed in a broader scope of the Western geopolitical arena. Upon an investigation of the wider literature on policy development, alternatively, the evidence indicates the presence of a conflict model, a theory that political decisions are made beforehand and are confirmed by reports and research targeted at strengthening the credibility of the policy's design. The two perspectives within the conflict model are first the pluralist approach, which accounts for political forces being derived from numerous groups in society, all competing to advance their own political interests through scientific rhetoric, and second, the elitist approach, which accounts for political forces being derived from a small group of society who control vast portions of available resources and the institutions that produce them. Also, it should be observed that elites will often use the appearance of pluralist conflict itself to accomplish hidden agendas. We will discuss historical comparisons in light of these theoretical models separated into two parts. Part A will discuss the British-China opium trade, and Part B will discuss the policy development in both the UK and US thereafter. A few questions I would like you to consider throughout this discussion are: what are the common threads or themes between these historical trajectories? What are the relationships between policy and binary oppositions, such as either natural or medicinal, either legal or illegal, and either legitimate or criminal? Does colonial enterprise still exist today? To what extent, and who are among the colonized? What insights could the topics under investigation possibly provide in light of current events such as the Chinese-American trade war, the Hong Kong demonstrations, and the virus outbreak, its origins, and the xenophobic sentiment that has become more apparent? Part A, the original Tea Party, the origins of the opium market. Although the opium trade had previously existed, we can locate when the trade began to develop at a much more rapid pace. We will begin with the British Empire's reliance on tea revenues throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. An incredible portion of British government revenue came from the importation and domestic sale of Chinese tea. Some sources say as much as 7% of GDP came from the tea market, which is actually a massive number. But China was getting tired of the foreign influence on their markets and placed heavy tariffs on the British trade. The outflow of British silver and the increasing trade deficit hammered the British Empire, who were in need of revenues to offset their foreign expenditures, such as the Crimean War. The British had to find a more equitable method of trade with China in order to supply the incredible British demand for Chinese tea, a commodity whose revenues were fundamental to the British government's operation. They had to find something that could trade with China to offset the cost of tariffs, something that had a great demand in the Chinese economy. And what was that commodity? Yep, opium. And because Britain realized they could grow poppies in India and produce much stronger opium quite effectively and efficiently, this became the major commodity for trade with Chinese merchants. One problem, though: opium consumption and trade in China was definitely illegal. Addiction was also becoming a major problem among the Chinese population. However, this did not stop the British, who illegally supplied an ever-expanding Chinese opium market as if it was completely legal. Furthermore, the fact that it was illegal actually turned out to be an exceptionally lucrative aspect of the opium trade. The British opium trade was built on a tradition of southern independence from Beijing and a well-developed and often illicit system of Chinese trading. After the British East India Company acquired monopoly over the Indian opium-growing districts, the British shipping industry dominated the Bengal opium trade out of Calcutta and its illegal trade in Canton ports. Chinese consumption of opium went from 200 chests annually in 1729 to 1,000 chests annually in 1767, less than 40 years. Even though the trade was illegal, this did not stop the Chinese officials from collecting tariffs on the opium. As the Chinese consumption of opium increased, so too did the illegality and regulation of British trade. And as this increased, so too did the profits of the Chinese merchant class, traditionally the lowest level of the Chinese caste system. Chinese merchants bought tea and silk inland at low prices and bartered them with foreigners on the coast for the drug, whose real cash value depended on the merchants' ability to resell it to consumers at much higher prices. The profitability of the opium trade to these Chinese was an essential element in the expansion of the British trade. In this case, as in others, supply preceded demand. By 1830, the Chinese began to notice the threat the illegal opium trade not only posed nationally, moral and health consequences, but more importantly, the threat it posed to Chinese sovereignty. Stricter regulations and punishments were administered, but to no substantial effect, however. With silver now flowing out of China and opium addiction expanding at an incredible rate, an economic crisis ensued, and finance and commerce suffered greatly. Some within the Chinese government actually advocated for the decriminalization of opium consumption and trade, but to no avail, and its illegality continued to increase. So too did the inflation of monopoly pricing, propelling the expansion of the market. And as if this wasn't enough, the market wasn't expanding quick enough for the British Crown, who decided to take over the monopoly from the British East India Company. After a failed attempt at diplomacy and persuading the deregulation of the trade, the British Crown had a second strategy for market expansion that their predecessors did not have at their disposal, adding the heavy guns and steamships of the British Navy. In 1839, the First Opium War erupted and lasted until 1842. The British Navy's technological superiority decimated the Chinese, and after the Treaty of Nanking, China was now open to the West, and one of the spoils of this war was the concession of Hong Kong to the British. Both parties felt they had conceded far too much, and tensions continued to rise as the trade deficit was crippling China. The Second Opium War of 1856 to 1857 was inevitable, as the Chinese, who felt the imposition of the West on Chinese life, still refused to both legalize opioid consumption and open the Chinese market to foreign opium trade, and who were also simultaneously engaged in the Taiping Rebellion, the bloodiest civil war of the 19th century, which is crazy considering all the civil wars of the 19th century. Although the Chinese government barely managed to hold off these rebellions, they were absolutely decimated by the European onslaught. As Anglo-Franco forces steamship rolled the Chinese defenses, China was forced to open the Chinese market to foreign opium trade and were also forced to adopt Western styles of commerce. China was now subject to the colonial directives of both the British and French, but also the US and Russia. As Brown observes, the accomplishments of contemporary organized illegal drug traders seem to be relatively modest when compared with those of the British, which for more than a century bribed, bullied, and waged war to promote their product in a huge country that had officially excluded it. Part B. Policy and the Rise of the American Pharmaceutical State, a New Era of Colonial Rule. A Canadian perspective on policy development could be said to have developed in a similar manner to that of the British policy development, although not exclusively, and it lags behind British and American policy. As a British colony itself, Canada public policy on opioid consumption and regulation has merely adopted not only the policy, but the problem itself. One of the underlying messages my argument seeks to articulate is that American anti-drug policy ultimately dictates all other global policies. Policy development in the UK, the transformation from colonial power to pharmaceutical power. The first sign of public concern for the opioid use and its consequent attempt for control was established in 1857 when the drug was implicated in a series of homicides. A bill was proposed to restrict and regulate the sale of poisons, including opiates. However, because of vigorous opposition by members of the Pharmaceutical Society, the bill was not enacted until 1868. This act would require opiates only to be sold by registered individuals such as chemists, but restrictions such as amounts of sold opium were absent from the legislation. By 1874, an anti-opium movement had developed due in large part to the British exploitation of the Chinese. The movement pressured the appointment of a commission on the existence of the opium trade, but its report, however, did more to rationalize the government's pro-opium position. Only one author of the commission opposed its vindication of the industry and the revenues it substantiated. Henry Wilson voiced his concern that the commission was nothing more than an elaborate defense of the East India Company and of the present government of India. The conclusions were accepted, however, and the medical profession decided to let the laws of supply and demand govern the use of opium. It wasn't until the 20th century that an anti-opium pressure, and largely fueled by the United States, that policy development began to change. It should be noticed that opioid addiction was still a relatively small issue in the population of the UK. Beginning with the Pharmacy Act of 1908, the developing drug policy of the UK began to change towards more regulation, and again, largely due to the growing influence of American pressure. One distinction between the UK policy and the US policy, however, was observable in the way addiction came to be seen. Contrary to the more criminal and moral view prevalent in the United States, addiction came to be seen in Britain essentially as a medical problem. Throughout the rest of the 20th century, as regulation continued to increase, so too did British opioid use. The Dangerous Drug Act of 1967 was a restriction on the prescription of opioid and related substances, but also required doctors to notify authorities of suspected addicts. Immediately following the act, the illicit price of heroin increased. As well, drug-related convictions began rapidly increasing as law enforcement of various drug offenses also increased, and further penalties were enforced on doctors who irresponsibly prescribed opioids or failed to report suspected addicts. During this period, it is interesting to note that the reporting of suspected addicts decreased, as in many cases supply preceded demand, and in this case supply also preceded legislation. Here is where the distinction between political coercion, as operated in colonial ventures in India and China, and political persuasion, as operates domestically, becomes important. The Dangerous Drug Act of 1920 was the first legislation that outlined a distinction between medical and non-medicinal uses of substances, which soon became a distinction between traditional natural drugs like opium and modern manufactured pharmaceuticals that were retailed by the pharmacies. Policy development of the U.S., anti-competition, criminalization, price control, and the pharmaceutical monopoly over the opium market. In 1840, the U.S. passed a bill as a revenue device to tax opium imports, but in the 1850s and 60s, due to a labor shortage, a massive influx of Chinese immigrants occurred. Changes began to appear in both the patterns of opium use and the attitudes towards this drug, which was increasingly associated with Chinese immigrants, especially when smoked and not drunk. Opium smoking spread from Chinese to whites, principally those adventurous persons who frequented the Chinese ghettos that had recently been created through racist residential restrictions. Prior to the 1870s, no public concern existed, and in fact, opium allowance was included in labor contracts as a bonus to attract Chinese laborers, and also to retain them at low wages. As Chinese laborers became more of an economically important asset, the white middle class began to resent the competition the Chinese immigrants posed to their livelihoods. Opium became the major strategy to combat the threat it posed. The first opium and U.S. anti-narcotic crusade occurred from 1875 to 1880. The legislation that materialized often targeted specific methods of opium use by the Chinese and omitted the methods used by the wider white general public, such as drinking opium, which was considered normal, and even a method used by doctors. This would all contribute to the harassment of Chinese immigrants, further embodied in the illegality of Chinese importation of opium, while American importation of opium was perfectly legal. The next major development began after the American victory in the Spanish-American War of 1898, when Protestant missionaries advocated that opium addiction in the newly acquired Philippines region was becoming a problem, and pressured Roosevelt to crack down on opium trafficking. This was supported by the American administration because it offered them a far more influence in the Pacific region. An anti-opium movement was thus born. Interestingly, by 1914, 27 states and cities had enacted laws against opium smoking, but importation continued to increase. Supreme Court decisions of the time did more to expand federal powers in commerce and taxation than regulate the use of such drugs, which ultimately enabled the use of federal police to suppress certain substances under the guise of regulating tax or interstate commerce. Before the Harrison Act, illicit traffic was not existent, and there was no link between addiction and criminality, and the number of addicts in prisons was not existent. After this act, however, this completely reversed.